give everybody a few minutes to just online, and then or a minute, and then we'll start. Kim, yeah, thank you. Okay, Kim, I will give it one more minute, and then we'll get started. I think we're at about 60, so let's get to 100, and then we can roll. Leveling out. Okay, let's. Okay, we'll get started. So thanks everybody for joining this Driving Distributed Generation webinar series that's been organized by SAPVIA. Today's session, we're looking at the business case for distributed generation, and I'd like to thank our partners, the Energy Intensive Users Group and the Minerals Council of South Africa, and in particular our sponsors who've helped us put together this wonderful program, RMB and Genesis Eco Energy. We've got, so Kim, I think you can just jump to the next slide, please. I'll introduce myself. My name's Chanda. You can go back to the first one. Chanda Ngumalo. I'm the Vice Chairperson at SAPVIA. So I've just been asked to facilitate the webinar and manage our way through our wonderful speakers. There's a few social media hashtags on there. So if you want to tag us on LinkedIn, and if you want then to follow up for the recordings, please visit the SAPVIA website after the webinar. So you can go to the next one, which is a bit of an introductory slide. So things have been changing quite rapidly in the distributed generation space over the past couple of months. We've seen the 100 megawatt announcement by the president, although still waiting for Schedule 2. And really what we wanted to do with this series is to give an overview and introduction to those of you who don't really know anything about the distributed generation space, but also provide in-depth information for those of you who have been in it for a while. So in today's session, the aim really is to help you objectively evaluate the business case for solar PV. And depending on what perspective you're looking at, be it residential or corporate, or looking at it from a municipality point of view, our speakers are going to take you through the different options that there are and procedures and processes that you need to think through to come to a decision as to whether to look at solar PV. So in general, the economics of solar are improving all the time. Modules prices are coming down. We've also got rising electricity costs. I'm sure a lot of you have had increased bills from Eskom or your municipality in the past few months, plus the load shedding that we've had to go through for the past few months. And all of these factors need to be taken into consideration when we look at the business case for solar PV. So I'm going to I'm going to hand over to our panel shortly, but sorry, if you can go back, Kim, but just to give you an overview of what we're planning for the next couple of months. So the next session will be looking at procuring solar PV and a detailed guide for, now that you've decided that the business case makes sense, how will you actually procure a PV system? Then the fundamentals of actually building these projects, operating and maintaining them, and finally combining that with storage and what the future looks like for that. So our panel, you can Jump to the next slide, Kim. Thank you. On our panel, we've got Hugh Haywarden from our sponsor, RMB, and Hugh's the head of business development for infrastructure finance. We've got Bruno Chingandu from Nedbank, who's an executive research and insights in the retail and business banking division. Josh Depenar, energy advisor from Sustainable Energy Africa. And last but not least, Adam Becker from Broadreach Energy. So we will take questions. Please put questions in the Q&A and we can try and answer them as we go along, but ideally we'll put all the questions to the end of the session so that everybody gets a chance to go through their presentation. And so without further ado, I will hand over to Hugh as the first speaker.
Thanks very much, Chanda, and afternoon, everyone. I think I've been asked to speak on various business models for distributed generation, but I guess in some of the first speaker, I need to introduce and maybe frame my understanding of distributed generation. So if I could have the next slide, Tim. I know I'm talking about the next slide. One more. There we go. So I think obviously I'm talking to a fairly learned audience here. You're all generally in the renewables game and understand the South African context quite well. But I guess for me to frame my understanding of distributed generation, why we're at this point we're at, where it's of such interest, and particularly in South Africa, the context of how it's moved to where we are at the moment. In the historically, given that we're a coal mining company, generation's always where you find the fuel, and that goes for most fossil fuel fired generation. So historically, in well-established economies where large amounts of electricity needed to be generated, it's quite close to fuel, because the easiest way to transport energy, as I've said in the fourth bullet down, quickest way to transport energy is on wires, and the cheapest. So you'll have a situation like a good example is the Mosel smelter in Mozambique, gets its energy from Witbank in South Africa, and a special transmission line was built. The Matraca line was built primarily to cater for that. We could argue that now that there's renewables, we don't need to be close to fuel because the fuel blows and shines everywhere. But I'll go so far as to say I think what we've seen and what we're seeing now in the REAP Round 5 process, that the Northern Cape is becoming constrained for projects because the evacuation challenges that overlay the transmission lines there. The Northern Cape might also be seen as localized or centralized generation, the very high solar resource. So what I think distributed generation also means is generally smaller, more nimble, and therefore closer to the load. I think that's the primary driver for distributed generation is close to load. I don't necessarily mean it to be renewables. We can discuss distributed generation as an on-site cogen plant or using your off-cut wood or so on. That's also distributed generation. But given this is SAPIA, and we tend to be focused on renewables in this country because of our abundant resources, distributed generation generally will be renewable. The impacts this have are, I think in future we'll see that business locations will be anywhere. They'll be where transport is easiest. They'll be where consumers are. They don't necessarily need to think of electricity as a constraint to location when setting up a new business. I also think the cost of electricity overall will come down because you're not going to get transmission losses. Renewables are cheaper, getting cheaper by the day. And as battery storage comes down, you're not going to be reliant on fossil fuels for non-renewable generation time. Can we have the next slide? So I guess the funding models, which is what I was asked to talk on, is what kind of distributed generation are we looking at? And there are many forms it could take. As I said, it doesn't have to be renewables. Generally, it will be, but one way or another, your fuel source is going to be either transported to where you want to generate or will be there already. And the raison d'etre behind building a 6,800 megawatt coal-fired power station has pretty much ceased to exist. So new funding models are going to exist. The generation we're talking about here is not REAP, which is large scale, and I would almost say centralized generation, i.e. closest to the strongest resources. But key is my fourth bullet at the top. Regulation is going to be critical. So as Chanda mentioned earlier, we've seen that anything under 100 megawatts isn't going to require a generation license. But what form that takes is going to be more critical than just the announcement thereof. And we do have a presenter later talking about municipal generation. That's also an absolutely critical part to play in the future, as we know it, of distributed generation. So the initial model I think we're seeing mostly in the mining companies is rather just equity fund your power plant. I'm going to assume for this presentation that wheeling exists. I think without wheeling and without the ability to wheel, distributed generation means on site, and it's in that case very limited in scope. So by distributed generation, anything within 10, 20 kilometers is still distributed generation to my mind, and would still require wheeling. So we're going to assume that wheeling exists. So if a mine's wanting to build a small power plant, they equity fund it, they get the tax breaks, the accelerated depreciation. It would compete with other capital projects that the mine is looking at, whether they buy new yellow metals, etc., compete on an equal basis. And more, the lower operating cost for electricity is becoming a compelling argument so that these distributed generation projects, are becoming viable for mines to enter into. They can, of course, run an IPP process where they put out an RFP for a dedicated solar developer to own the plant and for it to be debt funded on a ring fence basis. But a lot of what we're seeing is the mines starting to think, well, I'm consolidating that on my balance sheet anyway. I need the power. I want to control it. I've got a lot of engineers who like to do the sums, so we're going to equity fund it. It also will then have strong environmental benefits for them. It will look very good on annual reports. So I think the balance sheet funding model is what seems to be taking shape there somewhat. In that case, speaking from an R&B perspective, we maybe don't have too much of a role to play other than lending mine a general corporate facility which they'd use for this purpose. But it wouldn't be ring fenced, it wouldn't be project finance. The leaseback structure we do see a lot of. I guess a harmless punt, but RMB is involved in a debt funding platform called First, which does a lot of smaller projects. A lot are rooftop solar, and they are all done on an installment sale basis, which tends to work very well. An installable builder rooftop solar, they might be a smaller player, so not a huge amount of working capital. Maybe it costs 20 million rand to install. Once it's installed, First will buy it and gradually sell the facility back to the user on an installment sale basis. It's much more efficient in terms of documentation. It's not project financed. It doesn't need agreements that an SPV does, and
Kim, have we?
Apologies, I don't know what
Lost
happened
you.
there. Anyway, I'll carry on. On a lease structure, generally it also doesn't involve a complicated PPA, generation forecasts, etc. Metering and so on. That can happen, but it could also just involve a fairly levelized payment in terms of what you expect generation to be over the year. There might be some overs and unders, but given its small scale, it's not massive amounts of money. The third is obviously project finance. That's the game that we all understand from REAP. That's traditionally been the way of doing these power plants. But where this is different is now we're looking at corporate off-takers. We're not looking at Eskom with government guarantees. And so we need to rethink credit risk. In the instance, to get long tenors, the long tenor debt that we need in corporate offtake, project finance, IPPs, I think a major shift in credit risk is required. We need to have a look not at the off-taker's credit risk, because a corporate loan obviously goes 5-7 years at most. Take our minds off the off-taker and focus on the asset. And as I said, there's a massive assumption in my presentation that wheeling exists. And if you've got a stranded asset, which has traditionally been the greatest fear of project finance senior debt lenders, then you're getting 7-year debt for a structure like this with a corporate offtake. And I think we need to move away from that. If wheeling exists and you're selling a commodity that's well priced and in demand, there will be a market for it. And the asset itself has a 20 to 25-year life, if it's a PV plant. And in that case, the debt should be longer. So I think that is where credit risk is going to head on these assets, but the regulation is going to clarify that for us. Can you switch from one off-taker to the other without having a complete new registration process, licensing process, etc.? We're seeing in the EU at the moment, you can actually at the moment buy renewable energy by the hour in some countries. So there are more and more energy traders springing up. The disasters of Enron and California seem to be fading, and merchant power markets are becoming more and more the norm. And so should it. If renewables is available and it's cheaper, consumers should be able to switch to that form of energy. Next slide, please, Kim. So very briefly, a brief conclusion for me. This is the future of energy. There's absolutely no two ways about it. Not only is it impossible becoming increasingly difficult to fund massive fossil fuel power stations, but they're becoming less and less required. They're not the cheapest anymore. Yes, there's base load, but batteries are coming down very quickly. We do have to think about the grid. I know that anyone within the Eskom network now would say, well, this is all great, but we need to balance the grid, etc. But I think that can be done. And then those last three bullets of mine on the conclusion are also a very strong reason for doing this and becoming stronger by the day. It's becoming imperative for corporates to show greening, to show renewable energy as part of their energy consumption. And going to that is rural electrification, and the last mile connectivity to areas that aren't electrified is also going to become more and more imperative in order to balance out economic growth in the country. And so I think there's not just the obvious commercial drivers behind this, but there are environmental and community drivers behind it as well. So that's the business case. There's no doubt that the business case is a strong one. Thanks.
Do you want to go through the slide, Hugh, or are you?
Another harmless punt. People can cast their eyes over it.
Thank you. Um, so hopefully what the audience have gotten out of that and what I've taken out of it is to choose your business model, you actually need to understand what you want to achieve. Are you trying to lower your cost of electricity? Are you trying to go to improve your ESG and your response to climate change? Do you have balance sheet or do you need to lend? And take all of these different moving parts, I think, and then choose a path down which you want to go, whether that be leasing or the project finance. I have a question, even though we're not supposed to ask questions, on your credit risk discussion. Is that Hugh or is that RMB's view on the longer tenor for private offtakes?
That's a grey area at the moment. It's definitely Hugh's view, and we are getting our credit to start to understand that. I think what's going to be important for all the banks is what is gazetted, which is now slightly overdue. But we need to see what form Schedule 2 takes, who you can buy to, who you can sell to. If the under 100 megawatt announcement means that only on site, well, then we haven't moved on at all. If it opens the way for wheeling, then I think the 15-year, 20-year credit view will become an easier one for the banks to take.
Okay, thank you. All right, so just a reminder to everybody, if you have questions, just pop them in the Q&A, but otherwise we'll keep moving through our speakers. So Kim, I think you can start popping through the next slide. Our next speaker is Bruno Chingandu from Netbank, and he's going to talk to us about the business case for residential PV.
Okay, thank you, Chanda. So thank you everyone for joining, and thank you for inviting me to this talk. So I've been brought in to speak about the business case for residential solar. So pretty much just looking at individuals. I think the right place to start would probably be on the first slide. Just change slide. Next slide, please. Is on the costs of people, the cost of solar solutions. And so if you look at the current people taking up solar for their homes, paying a once-off cost. The costs range between 100,000 rands. As you start to increase, you get more and more and end up over 100,000 rands, over 200,000 rands, which I don't have to tell people in this room is pretty much unattainable for most South Africans. And so what you find is a lot of people explore it, but then find that the cost is just astronomical and they don't even consider going forward. However, what we have been seeing is there has been activity happening, which I don't think I have to tell you about on the next slide. Next slide. Just firstly, the introduction of load shedding again this year. We've gotten a lot more issues with electricity supply, which right now, with a lot of people working from home, has got a lot more consequences when people don't have electricity. And people have been starting to look at a lot more alternatives, thinking about things like generators. Some people taking up a couple of like inverters at home, just to give them a little bit of power during the day. However, the next reason, which is on the next page, is the electricity costs are pretty much skyrocketing. And this year we got a 15% increase. A couple of years ago, we got a 19% increase, and this is starting to make it a lot more costly for people to just manage their bills. And even people who are looking for alternatives like generators, what happens is, yes, they get a generator that gives them some electricity during load shedding, but they add on a new cost, which makes their lives a lot more cumbersome in terms of paying their bills. And so on the next slide, sorry. So if we take a step back and look at where we come from, we had a very low rate of electricity increases from like 87 to about 2007, where we had electricity going below inflation. And since 2008, when we had the first bout of load shedding, when we look at the prices from 2007 to 2019, it's gone up by 400%. Versus 98% of inflation. So basically, we are seeing the rate of our bills going up much higher than inflation, which is also generally going to be much higher than what we are currently getting from a salary expectation going forward. And on the next slide, this is, from a client's perspective, the kind of pressures that we're seeing on our side. So we're seeing people's costs are starting to escalate much more than their income is, which makes it, from a bank's perspective, very important for us. It makes it very difficult for them to pay their current loans because their bills and expenses are just going up much faster. And that also impacts their ability to borrow going forward for things that will help their lives, because their affordability reduces. And it doesn't look like this is getting any cheaper. If you look at where we're coming from, you look at the line that I showed you before and the trajectory of the electricity price and what's expected, it seems like we're going to get more and more increases going forward, and it's unlikely to be at CPI. We pretty much expect it to be much higher than CPI. So on the next page, this is just an indication of what we kind of expect to see happening. So this, I'll take you through this. If you have somebody who is currently paying 2,000 rands a month for electricity, and you try to project what we expect to see happening going forward to the bills, in year one, yes, you're still paying 2,000 rands a month. By year 5, if it increases by 10%, you'll be paying almost 3,000 rands. And in 10 years, it'll be almost 5,000 rands if we get a 10% increase, which is fairly conservative, but we're still keeping it at the higher end. But even if we stick something as low as 5%, in the next 5 years, you're going to be paying about 2,500, and by year 10, you're going to be paying about 3,000 rands. And if you look at how much money has been spent over that period of time, for over a 10-year period, you're talking about between almost 400,000 rands to 300,000 rands that are being paid just for electricity, regardless of which outcome plays out. And if you compare this to the initial slide that I showed you with the costs, we're already seeing that these costs are outweighing what people would have paid for solar upfront, because those solutions were ranging between 100 to 200, depending on what kind of solution you need and what your needs are in terms of batteries and PVs. And even if this was discounted to today, it's still much higher than the cost of purchasing a solar system upfront. However, we still have the constraint of people not having 100,000 rands or 200,000 rands available to just purchase a solution. And so we try to find new ways to help people finance solar that makes it much more affordable for them. So on the next slide, this is just an example I'm going to walk you through around what we have found working for some of our clients at Netbank. And so basically that's using your home loan to finance a solar solution. So this is an example of a client who got a loan of a million rands for a house about 10 years ago. If you look at the rates now, the installment would be around 7,000 rands right now, and a balance of about 670,000 rands with 10 years left to go. So if you look, if this client had a bill of 2,000 rands and they financed a solution of 150,000 rands on their home loan and remain in the same term, the installment would go up from 7,000 to about 9,500, which is an increase of about 1,700, you see at the bottom there. And if the solution is able to take care of the client's entire electricity costs, what we would see is the client would immediately have a saving of 200 rands every month for the first year. And as time progresses, these savings go up because we expect the price of electricity to keep on increasing. And so what we see is in the next year, the client will be saving about 400 rands if it goes up by 10%. In 5 years, they'll be saving about 1,400 rands every month. And by year 10, it'll be almost 3,300 they'll be saving every month. And so what you get is somebody getting solar, firstly, be able to have, they have a reliable supply of electricity. They don't have to take out an outlay of money from their savings, and they have a monthly cash flow release every single month from month one, provided that this takes care of electricity bills in its entirety. And on the next page, so this is just giving you a view of how at Netbank we are trying to help our clients do this. And this is, we're looking at solar in the context of developments. We're looking at edge developments for certain properties that are showing use of PVs in the developments. But for individuals who want to do this in their own homes, we have at the bottom there, you see the bottom right, there's a tab there where people are able to go and ask for help. And the next slide, On the next slide, we provide pretty much not only the financing solutions that are available in terms of linking solar with your home loan. We also help you find accredited suppliers, and in this case, we use the PV Green Card accredited installers because we're much more comfortable with the service levels there. Give you a little bit of advice around the next steps that you need to take, and also give you some tips around how to save money from your key using a couple of tools that we have. And ultimately, with this, what we're hoping to do is see a lot more people taking up solar, which doesn't just take them off the grid and give them good electricity supply, and which is also good for the environment, but ultimately helping them save on a monthly basis, which helps them manage their debt better, helps them manage their bills better, and gets them to invest more of their money in other aspects of their lives. And that's it for me. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bruno. I think that was useful. There's one question that maybe you can just talk to quickly before we go on to the next speaker regarding Sharia compliant options for residential solar solutions. Is that something that Netbank look at, or can you point Mohsin in the right direction?
So we are exploring our Sharia lending options. It's still development. So I think in the next couple of months, we should be seeing something coming out from our table.
Thank you. And I think, Mohsin, the contact details for all of the speakers should be on the slides, which will be shared afterwards. Okay, I'll save the rest of the questions for you for the Q&A at the end. So we're going to move from residential the residential space to the municipal space, which I think is more than a bit confusing for most of us. So let me introduce our speaker, who's Josh Depenar from Sustainable Energy Africa, and who works in advising the municipalities on distributed generation. Josh, over to you.
Thanks, Chanda, and hi everyone. Great, there we go. So yeah, so I'm from Sustainable Energy Africa, and we are a not-for-profit organization supporting municipalities with various sustainable energy sort of related projects and integrating solar into the grid, etc. So I'm not going to speak as sort of directly to the business case for SSEG for municipalities to install. I think it's clear that there's a great business case for municipalities to install solar on their own buildings. But I think procurement processes in municipalities are the main sort of hurdle to municipal PV procurement. But I'm going to just more speak around sort of municipal perspectives and integrating solar or SSEG into municipal grids and how that sort of interplays with the business case for solar. All right, so I hope it's useful. Let's dive in. Thanks. So I'm going to go through or just touch on the municipal SSEG support program. So that's what we're doing to support municipalities, and then briefly touch on the status of SSEG or embedded generation in municipalities. So how many municipalities are sort of embracing it and have processes for connecting solar to the grids. And then thirdly, you're going to touch on the revenue impact of SSEG. So that's the impact on municipal revenue. That's a key concern for municipal officials. So we're going to look at how solar impacts municipal revenue, and then sort of from that look at how municipalities can respond by setting sensible SSEG tariffs that still promote solar but reasonably protect the municipality's revenue, and then some sort of key takeaway messages. Okay, let's go right in. Thanks, Kim. So we're starting with the SSEG support program. So here's a map of the municipalities that we are supporting to sort of develop SSEG processes. At the top there, it says it's a SALGA, DMRE, and GIZ funded program, and the logos of the partners are down the left. So yeah, SALGA, Mineral Resources and Energy, or DMRE, and then GIZ funded through the South African German Energy Program. And there's ourselves, Sustainable Energy Africa, and we work closely with the Solar Training Center and Route 63 Training and the CSIR. So there's a bunch of organizations trying to sort of support municipalities to develop policies, processes, and I'm going to touch on that now. And just to say that there's sort of over 70 municipal partners in all provinces of the country who've attended trainings and who are working towards developing processes for solar PV grid connection. So yeah, so it's really exciting. Of course, there's challenges and lots of roadblocks, but there's progress. So we'll look into what this comprises of. Thanks, Kim. Just to say that there's a nice sort of overview video on YouTube. I think, yeah, the link is there, and I believe the slides might be shared. So it's a kind of 20-minute documentary style on all the elements of municipal SSEG process, why municipalities need to manage it, what the elements are, and how municipalities can sort of do it sensibly. Yeah, so just to say that's a resource. Thanks, Kim. And then I think this is of interest. So the status of SSEG in municipalities. All right, let's go for it. So there's another resource, Sseg report that documents how many municipalities have processes and tariffs in place. So that's the full report. And I'm going to show the summary sort of graph on the next slide, which is the sort of highlights. And this shows the number of municipalities that have SSEG processes. So the blue line at the top is the number of municipalities that allow SSEG to connect to their grid. And it's increased up to 56 municipalities as of 2020 last year. So that's sort of the majority of the economic activity. I mean, those 56 municipalities cover most major sort of cities and towns. And then of those 56 municipalities, 44 of them have an official application process. So you can get in touch with the municipality, they'll send you the application forms and you can connect, or at least go through the process of connecting solar to the grid. And of those 44, 31 municipalities have an SSEG tariff in place. So that what we sort of consider an SSEG tariff is where the municipality credits the customers for feeding back into the grid. So we know that's really the first step towards the sort of modern future smart distribution grid where there's high transactions and feeding into the grid and smart charging and all these sort of things. So I mean, just trying to break it down to the basics of that, the first sort of step forward away from just buying all the electricity from Eskom and selling it onto the customers is having this export credit in place and then getting the billing systems in place to compensate customers for feeding into the grid. So really encourage that, and that's why it's one of the key metrics there. And then if we go to the next slide, it shows what these SSEG tariffs look like. So there's the 31 across the country, and they range from sort of 10 to 40 cents in some municipalities, all the way up to above 100 cents per kilowatt hour that the municipality will credit the customer for feeding into the grid. And the average is around 74 cents. And yeah, so that's the spread of the 31 municipalities who have export credits in place. And that was last year. And excitingly, 6 more municipalities got their SSEG export credit tariffs approved now as of 1st of July, the start of the municipal financial year. So that 31 will be 37 in our next Sapphire webinar. So the numbers are increasing. And I'll sort of share some thoughts on why municipalities resist this. But yeah, but to say that more are coming on board and the numbers are increasing. So it's positive. Thanks, Kim. Yeah, so this shows the various elements of a municipal SSEG process. I'm not going to go into it, but just to say that there's, municipalities need to get their policies in place, application forms, and they need to assess applications, commission systems, change the meter, install a bidirectional meter, have a tariff in place. And then there's contracts and bylaws, and they need to keep record of SSEG systems. So it's a whole new area of operation for municipalities. No excuse not to get it done. Municipalities need to get this done, but these are the various elements that it includes. And we have a sort of 5-day training that municipalities attend, and this is the GIZ funded project. And then they sort of walk away with template policies. And I don't know, for those who've worked with municipal applications and know this whole sort of architecture quite well. Thanks, Kim. I think the next one's just an animation on around tariffs. Yeah, so this is today we're focusing on the business case, which is just that piece there, the tariffs, but it falls in a bigger sort of SSEG municipal process. Thank you. Let's see what's next. Okay, so so this is I guess where it gets interesting, and a lot of municipalities resist solar because of the threat of their revenue. So that was a key fear for municipalities, is that they're going to reduce their sales of solar PV, I mean of electricity, because of solar PV, and that's why they want to resist solar. And we still see that a lot, especially in municipalities who, yeah, let me not go too much into the sort of theories about it, but to say that this graph here is a sort of a balancing beam of the revenue impact. So first point is that solar PV does impact a municipality's revenue. There's no disputing that. And that the main reason is that on the left-hand side, the blue block says that solar PV does reduce the sales of a municipality. But on the other hand, the orange block says that while the sales are reduced, there's also a reduction in the amount of electricity that the municipality needs to buy from Eskom. So that doesn't quite balance it out, but those are two elements of the sort of the revenue impact. The green block says that when the customer feeds into the grid, then the municipality needs to compensate them for that electricity. But on the other hand, that also is a decrease in cost, because that electricity they can then on-sell to the next door neighbor, and that's then cheaper than buying it from Eskom. And then the fifth sort of major revenue impact is the reduction in technical losses, because solar PV, when feeding into the grid, the distance traveled is, from the panel to the next door neighbor's house and then selling it into that meter, the distance is much less, and the losses, obviously being proportionate to line length, is much less than from the municipality's intake point to that same customer. So when solar customers export into the grid and the municipality can on-sell it, it's also a reduction in technical losses. So these are the sort of 5 major impacts on municipal revenue. I see a comment, technical loss will be marginal. It is very marginal. It's that's the smallest of the 5, but nonetheless, it is an element, and it is a sort of, actually, depending on the network, it can, when it's far down a low voltage network, the technical loss can be sort of considerable. I mean, not major, much less than the other 4, but still worth considering in the revenue impact calculation. So these are the 5 impacts, and then we built a spreadsheet. I think over the last 5 years, as part of this program, there's been various partners and consultants involved in sort of building the spreadsheet up to understand the impact of solar on municipal revenue. And on the next slide, I show some case studies on, I think there's some case studies. Yeah, great. So these are 4 municipal tariffs, I'm not showing the model here, but it is freely available. I actually didn't put the link in the slides here, but the model is available and for anyone to have a look at. Super robust. And okay, so there's 4 municipal tariffs down here, and what we're looking at is the revenue impact when customers move from being normal residential customers on the left-hand side, consuming energy at that tariff, and then moving across to being solar customers on these SSEG tariffs and behaving the way solar customers do. The typical load profile, a typical solar PV size, maybe exporting for residential customers during the day, commercial customers typically not exporting. Okay, so sort of behaving the way average customers tend to behave. So on the left-hand side, Metro 1 has these are 2 years ago tariffs, by the way. So these are slightly outdated, but the sort of concept and principles remain the same. So customers are on a 1.71 rand per kilowatt hour. Normal customers, then they move across onto the SSEG tariff, which is 245 Rand fixed charge, same energy charge of 1.71 rand, and then there's an export credit of 74 cents per kilowatt hour. Metro 2 has an inclining block tariff of 142 to 195, and then also moves across onto the SSEG tariff, has this fixed charge, the same energy charge, and then there's this export credit of 10 cents. And then intermediary city 1 has a same energy charge, 176, also has the high fixed charge of 380 Rand, they have a time of use tariff and a time of use export credit. So the time of use energy charge is from 82 in the summer low season and up to 325 in winter peak, and then export credit also on time of use basis. Okay, and then intermediary city 2 has a really high basic charge for normal customers, and then that basic charge stays the same for 2 for SSEG customers. Okay, so I've got to skim over it because I don't want to eat into time into sort of the colleagues' time. But basically, there's these 4 case studies, and I think the next point summarizes the next slide summarizes the impacts and what we're trying to say. Okay, there they go. Okay, so wait, can you go back one? Let's not show the sweet spot just yet. Yes. Okay.
Josh,
So basically,
you don't need to rush. It's fun.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chanda. Because we can spend far too long looking at these case studies. So I think the point what we're trying to say here is that some of those tariffs previously, and I'll comment on which ones they were, can increase the revenue. So these graphs, the chart showing the x-axis shows the percentage of customers with solar PV. So this is residential customers. So all the way across to 20% of the customers having solar PV on the right-hand side, and then the y-axis shows the percentage change in municipal revenue. So up shows an increase in municipal revenue, and down shows a decrease in municipal revenue when customers move from being normal residential customers to being these solar PV customers on SSEG tariffs. So interestingly, some of those tariffs, the orange one and the gray one, so Metro 2 and Intermediary City 1, see quite an increase in revenue when customers move on to these SSEG tariffs. And that's because the one had a really high basic charge, fixed charge of 380 Rand per month. So when customers move from being normal residential customers on an inclining block tariff, and then they move on to this high basic charge tariff, that's an increase in revenue for the municipality. And then the other one, Metro 2, the orange one, they were only compensating the customer 10 cents per kilowatt hour. So when compared to what you would be paying Eskom for electricity, that 10 cents is obviously a huge bargain, much cheaper than buying power from Eskom. So that's an increase in revenue. So that's obviously a theoretical increase. The question is, will customers behave like this, and will they continue to feed into the grid when you're only offering them 10 cents? That's sort of the question we probe municipalities with and say, but do you really think your customers are going to want to register their systems if this is the tariff you're offering them? And that's why the sort of speech bubble at the top right there says that those increase in revenue tariffs offer an unfavorable business case for PV. And I think this is what we're getting to in the session here is that municipal tariffs really can impact the business case for solar. And on the other hand, the sort of yellow line that dips downwards, that's the municipality that didn't increase the fixed charge. So they kept the tariff the same, and they offered a really generous export credit of, I think it was 1 Rand 50 per kilowatt hour, that they'll actually credit the customer. So it was sort of a net metering arrangement. And that credit that they crediting the customer is more than what they would have been paying Eskom. So effectively, that's revenue negative for the municipality. So when customers move on to solar, it actually erodes the municipality's revenue. And then Metro 1, that sort of blue line that hovers in the middle there, Kim, if you can press the next button, it should just do an animation to show that's the sweet spots that we try and work with municipalities to find, is the sort of range where there's a good business case for solar while the municipalities don't have a huge revenue impact. And when the tariffs allow for that, then municipalities feel much more sort of comfortable with the tariff arrangement, and then they're very comfortable to sort of embrace solar, work with solar, and many municipalities around the country have worked into that sort of sweet spot. Some municipalities prefer, very resistive to solar. They say, no, we want high basic charges. We don't want to compensate them anything for feeding into the grid. Then that's that sort of upwards revenue positive, but bad business case for solar. And that's really not good for the solar industry. And then on the other hand, the the line going downwards, it's a little bit of a loss in revenue, but very favorable business case for PV. And some municipalities say, you know what, we're happy to lose a little bit of revenue on electricity sales because we're supporting this industry, it's green growth, it's local economic opportunities, local jobs. So, I mean, it's at the end of the day, it's the municipality's decision what they do, but this is maybe a useful sort of framing for it. Okay, thanks, Kim. Then, so with all that in mind, what does a sensible SSEG tariff look like? We're focusing mainly on residential tariffs here because commercial customers tend not to feed into the grid and they already have these fixed charges and demand charges in place. So the residential customers' tariffs are a little bit more nuanced. And so if we go into it, Kim, I think we'll see what, okay, so a departure point for a sensible tariff, I think first is to recognize that municipalities do have these fixed costs and not all their costs reduce when customers consume less electricity. So solar does reduce the municipalities' energy purchases from Eskom, but it doesn't reduce their sort of salaries, repairs, capital charges, other costs. Yes, of course, some of there's sort of questions around the efficiency and prudency of municipal expenses, but I think that's sort of separate to this discussion. The point is that even a brilliant, efficient municipality has fixed costs that do need to be recovered when customers install solar. And so there's it's a sort of unbundled, cost-reflective tariff has some element of a fixed charge. And that's what I think on the next slide, Kim will go into. That the key principle for tariffs around the world is cost reflectivity. And of course, these should be informed by cost of supply studies, but just in the absence of a cost of supply study, just for a rule of thumb here, the fixed charge should be roughly between 200 to 400 Rand per month, preferably nearer to the 200 Rand per month. The energy charge tends to be kept the same as before, but ideally this is on a time of use because time of use tariffs then encourage optimum use of storage. If customers do have storage, they'll use that during peak and yeah, gives sort of sensible tariff signals. And then the third point is the export credit should equal the avoided cost. So what would the municipality have paid for the electricity from Eskom? It makes sense that the municipality credits the customer to the same value, which is the avoided cost. And that makes sense to be somewhere between, or the avoided cost on Megaflex tariff is somewhere between 70 and 90 cents. Excitingly, as well, I mean, excitingly for some, I guess, as Eskom tariffs continue to increase, this value of avoided cost goes up and up. And so the amount that municipalities should be crediting their customers for solar PV should increase too. So above sort of 90 cents and beyond. Who knows what where the ceiling of the Megaflex tariff is. Okay, thanks, Kim. I think I'm nearing the end here. Yeah, so the key messages, hopefully it was useful, and I think it's always challenging to bring the municipal perspective to a discussion like this. So I hope it's reasonably well received, and that we can see that there is another side, sort of another perspective, and that the grid needs to be maintained. So the key messages are that I think firstly, municipal distributors have to manage SSEG. Municipalities can't do nothing. They need to make sure that the grid is managed safely, and that's why these SSEG processes do need to be in place. Just to add to that, municipalities may not reject an application for SSEG without reason. So it's sort of the clause of non-discriminatory access, and so municipalities are mandated to manage SSEG, but also cannot reject applications without reason, such as grid impact studies or the like. So then, thanks, Kim. I think the next one is that municipalities are making steady progress towards embracing SSEG. So we saw the map and the numbers growing, but capacity constraints slow application approvals. And I think, I'm sure there's many people here who've struggled with municipal applications, and I know how frustrating they can be. And that's largely due to capacity constraints and that municipalities don't have dedicated personnel to manage this. So we really try and encourage municipalities to put job descriptions, put it on the organograms, get capacity to manage this new part of of the job. And then the third one is that tariff modernization. So these tariff changes, what we're saying about fixed charges, it's part of the energy transition around the world. So distribution utilities in the US and Europe are all sort of grappling with these same issues, and also receive feedback from customers that you're taxing the sun, and all these media articles about the fixed charges being unreasonable. And I guess in South Africa, it's understandable because the municipalities aren't the most efficient organizations, but this tariff modernization is part of the transition, but a win-win is possible. So I think that's that sweet spot we're talking about. Again, and I think there's fourth and fifth point, and then I'm done. I think, yeah, the fourth point is that, there's a great business case for commercial PV. We know that based on self-consumption with few barriers. There are barriers around the sizes, 1 megawatt, 100 megawatt, and barriers around municipal capacity, but it's happening, and there's almost a gigawatt, if not more, of PV already installed based on self-consumption. So that's really great. I think the fifth point is where the challenge lies, and that's around the resistance towards PV feed-in. Municipalities still, or many municipalities, don't quite have the head wrapped around the concept of feeding into the grid and selling it on, and the whole bidirectional flow of electrons in the distribution grid is still an area of resistance. And so I think that's an exciting way forward, and hopefully more business cases can be built on feeding into the grid. I think now many solar customers are reluctant to build a business case on feeding into the grid because the municipality can just change the feed-in tariff, year to year. So a 20-year investment that's sort of premised on feeding into the grid is quite a risky one, I think, at this stage, but hopefully we can sort of work towards de-risking that somehow. Thank you. And then I think the last slide is just the website where this is hosted, sseg.org.za, municipalities, and then thanks, Chanda, and then I'm done. I hope I haven't gone too much over time.
No, I think you're okay. We're ahead of time, I think. You've got lots and lots of questions, so I'm going to save them all. I think you're going to be the representative of all things municipality that are wrong, but so I'll hold them for the Q&A, and we'll go and have Adam do his presentation first, and then we'll come back and try and answer all of these questions. So Adam's going to talk to us about tax incentives, and I guess building the business case from a tax point of view. So Adam, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chanda. Thank you for the opportunity to present to everyone who's on today. Maybe you can just jump to the next slide. So always a good way to start a presentation is with a massive disclaimer, which is that I'm talking about tax. And whilst I did practice tax law about 14, that's now some time ago. And so my expert tax knowledge or professional tax knowledge is perhaps a bit rusty. So I'm going to this really practical perspective in terms of our involvement in the renewable energy industry. Little provisions in the tax laws, and what I'm not going to try and do is unpack those in detail. I'll try and cover things that are sort of high level and hopefully on an understandable basis. If you're dealing with any of these tax provisions, unfortunately, the lesson remains that you kind of have to go back to the Tax Act and read through the detailed provisions. If you can move to the next slide. So really the focus of what I want to chat about today are tax incentives that, and because the focus of today's presentation are tax incentives that enhance the business case or the financial case specifically for installing renewables. And because this is a SAPIA presentation, obviously specifically PV, there are a number of sort of regulatory or government policies which also play into that business case, and we've heard about a couple of them. I'm glad Josh spoke about feed-in tariffs, because in our experience, those are one of the sort of major regulatory or government policies that can have an impact. But really, the two main ones that I want to talk about today are 12B, the accelerated depreciation allowance, and then carbon tax. It might sound a little counterintuitive, but obviously the carbon tax is a stick, and it encourages business to move away from green successes towards renewables. I'll make brief mention of a couple of other provisions which relate predominantly either to sort of utility scale projects where you're wheeling power, and then to one or two incidental tax benefits which might be of interest. Can we move to the next slide? So starting with the one that's probably the most common or well known is the Section 12B, the depreciation allowance. And generally what 12B allows is a deduction for the cost of equipment that you've installed to use in your business in generating electricity from renewable resources. And then you can claim a deduction for that cost, in some instances either immediately or in other instances spread over 3 years. And what I've done here is I've pulled out of Section 12B the main considerations or the main provisions of that little piece of legislation. And as we go through, we'll just quickly unpack the relevant points coming out of that. Why do we call 12B an incentive? I think the reason is simply usually assets that you use in your business can only be depreciated or deducted from your tax bill over their useful lifetime, whereas 12B gives a special dispensation. So you can either deduct it immediately or over 3 years. If it weren't for 12B, you would only be able to write off the cost of PV, typically for inverters over 10 years, and for panels and the balance of plant, you're probably looking at up to 25 years. So there is quite a significant benefit to the returns from a PV project as a result of 12B. If you can move to the next slide. So firstly, what the section allows you to deduct is the cost of the system or the cost of the equipment that you're installing. SARS are very clever and wise to people's inventiveness, and they've defined cost as being the lesser of the actual cost of the equipment or the price that you could have bought that equipment for in an arm's length cash sale on the same date. So in other words, what they're doing is they're stopping any shenanigans where people try and inflate the cost of the equipment or move them between different companies that they own in order to maximize the tax deduction. That's just one point to note there. You can move to the next slide. Right, so then the next point is the definition of what equipment you're allowed to claim a deduction for, the cost of which equipment. So the Act uses these words: machinery, plant, implement, utensil, or article. But effectively what it boils down to is it's any movable equipment that forms part of your PV system. So movable then per definition excludes things such as the actual building or a property that you may have to buy. So if you've got a utility scale plant, you can't deduct the cost of acquiring the land. Your roads and fences, transmission lines, these sorts of things are not included within Section 12B. There are other sections of the Act which deal with those for purposes of utility scale plants. But then what is specifically included is not just, or what is deemed to form part of those assets are all of your installation and construction costs. So your labor costs, costs of employing an EPC in order to actually build the plant for you. Those are deemed to be included. And then there was recently a binding private ruling. So somebody applied to SARS for a ruling as to what costs they could deduct under 12B. And what that ruling made clear, and although it's a private ruling, so it's not of general application, it nevertheless gives an indication that SARS are happy to include in 12B other costs such as planning or project management costs, your engineering design costs, Site assessments, if you need to do those, so your structural roof assessment, if you're doing a rooftop system, or I suppose a geotech survey for utility scale plants, what they referred to in the ruling were the cost of delivery, so that's your logistics, actually transporting equipment to site, and the safety officer costs. What was interesting in the ruling is that for some reason, the person that claimed or that applied for the ruling specifically didn't claim a deduction for distribution boxes or distribution boards. That probably is on the basis that the distribution boards that they had to install weren't strictly necessary for the PV, that they had to have distribution boards anyway. But certainly my view would be that if you have to install new distribution boards as part of a PV system, you should be able to include that. The other thing that you can claim also as part of your system are any foundations or supporting structures. There's a specific provision which includes those costs, as long as they're designed specifically for your PV system and they have the same useful life. So what we're really thinking of there are your trackers, carports, mounting structures, roof racking, etc. The interesting piece and something that we've sort of encountered in practice is, what about the cost of a diesel generator or batteries? Now, at first, first glance, you'd say, well, that definitely doesn't form part of a PV or a solar PV generation system. But if you think that your PV system can't operate in the absence of a reference power supply, it would be an interesting one, because I would think that you could make the argument that if that reference power supply, your generator, your battery, is sized so as to allow your PV system to continue operating when there's otherwise no grid power, I think there's a reasonable argument to make that it's an essential piece of the equipment to allow the power to continue to be supplied. I think it would become a little bit more grey if you have a diesel or a generator or a battery which is designed to take the full load of a customer's site and that is significantly oversized in comparison to your PV. Unfortunately, there's no definite guidance on this from SARS, but it's certainly one of the aspects to think about. Can you perhaps move to the next slide? So the 12B deduction can be claimed if you are the owner of the equipment that was purchased, or if you purchased it under what the Act refers to as an installment credit agreement. This kind of feeds back to what Hugh and some others have been talking about today. So in deciding whether to finance a system through either a PPA or an installment sale or a finance lease, there is a difference in the treatment from a Section 12B point of view. So if you are an IPP and you're providing power under a PPA arrangement, you as the IPP would retain the 12B deduction. If you provide the equipment or the system to a client under either an installment sale or a finance lease, then your customer can actually claim the 12B deduction. So that can, in some instances, impact how you structure an arrangement depending on who best can use the deduction that they're getting. Can we move to the next slide? The other point about 12B is that it allows you to claim the deduction not just for new equipment, but also for second-hand equipment, as long as, and you can claim the deduction then for the first time that you start using that equipment in your business. So if you have equipment or a PV system that is installed on premises and you start conducting a business from those premises, then you can claim the 12B deduction for the cost of the PV system at that point. The other point about this requirement is that you can obviously only claim a deduction if you in fact use that system in your business. So you can't, unfortunately, get somebody to issue an invoice to your business for a residential system and then hope to claim the 12B deduction on that basis. If you move to the next slide. And then it's probably self-explanatory, but obviously the equipment that you're claiming the deduction for must be used to produce electricity from certain renewable resources. Thankfully, for purposes of the present presentation, PV is obviously one of those, but also you can see from the pictures there, you can also claim the deduction for wind power, CSP, small hydro under 30 megawatts, biomass, and then landfill gas systems. I can move to the next slide. So in addition to claiming the deduction for any of the equipment that we referred to above, if you effect any improvements to a system, and I'm sort of trying to think for myself what that would involve, but I guess if you upgrade equipment, if you upgrade inverters, replace panels with new panels of a higher efficiency or greater capacity at some point, you could include those, or you would be entitled to a deduction of those when you do so. Important point to note here is that this reference to improvements doesn't include repairs. So if you've got broken equipment or other repairs that need to be effected, then those are claimable under Section 11A as general OPEX expenditure in running your plant. We can move to the next slide. And then the important one is, how can you claim this deduction? And here there's a special benefit for smaller scale PV plants. So any PV plant under 1 megawatt of installed capacity. The Act doesn't define what installed capacity is, but general practice is that's the AC capacity of the plant. Under 1 megawatt, you can claim the full cost of that system in the year in which you bring it into use. So you get an immediate deduction for the full value of your plant, which in the case of a company would mean that if you're purchasing a 1 million rand system, you're going to save 280,000 rand in tax in the year in which you bring it into use. Can move to the next slide. Then for all other technologies and for any solar plant which is above 1 megawatt, you also have the accelerated deduction allowance, but you have to claim the allowance 50% in year 1, 30% in year 2, and 20% in year 3. So for larger systems and for technologies other than solar PV, you spread that deduction of the cost over 3 years. But it still provides a decent uptick in your returns from a project once you take that depreciation allowance into account. We can move to the next slide. I mentioned a couple of other deductions or tax incentives that are available. These are mostly relevant to utility scale plants. I won't spend too much time on them today, but there's Section 12D, which allows one to deduct the cost of electricity transmission lines, supporting structures and earthworks. There's Section 12U, which allows you to deduct cost of roads and fences, and then a Section 13 Quin, which allows you to deduct the cost of buildings forming part of a plant. I guess what you're thinking of there is sort of utility scale plant with a SCADA or control room, or perhaps a workshop and spares store. I won't go through those in detail. Generally, for electricity transmission lines and buildings, you can write the cost off over 20 years. And then for roads and fences, you have to have a plant larger than 5 megawatts, but then you can deduct the cost in the year in which you incur the expense on a once-off basis. The one sort of interesting thing to note, and it's probably, I think, going to become relevant given the increase of the generation license threshold to 100 megawatts, I think we're going to see, and we are seeing, a lot more interest from large corporate industrial users in taking power from utility scale plants. The problem with the current provisions relating to electricity transmission lines and buildings is that they stipulate that you have to own the equipment if you want to claim the allowance. Now, particularly, for example, in electricity transmission lines, if you apply to Eskom for a cost estimate letter or for a connection and you choose the self-build option, what actually happens is that you hand over the transmission lines at the end of the day to Eskom, which would mean that otherwise, well, from that date onwards, you wouldn't be able to claim the deduction that you would otherwise have been entitled to. So there is a separate section that they introduced into the Act, Section 12N, which effectively allows you to claim that deduction even if you've handed the electricity transmission lines or other improvements that you've made over to Eskom, as long as you've done that in terms of the REIPP. That provision hasn't been expanded to include similar arrangements for wheeling to commercial customers. So hopefully we will see some response out of SARS on this to change that situation, because the same principle should apply. If you can move to, you can in fact skip 2 slides and go to the next one. So that's the Section 12 deduction. Sorry, if you can just jump back one. The next sort of big tax topic, which we find contributes significantly to the economic case for renewable energy and for PV, is carbon tax. What's interesting to note in this regard is how carbon intense our electricity or Eskom's electricity generation is compared to other countries. So in the first graph on the left-hand side there, you can see that we're almost at a kilogram of CO2 per kilowatt hour of electricity, which puts us sort of, I think we're in fact highest in the world as far as that's concerned. And then in the graph on the right, you can see that although we are, I suppose, a third world country, we are emitting carbon amongst a group of, on a per capita basis, amongst a group of first world countries. So that's just a signal that there are large emitters of greenhouse gases in South Africa. There are a large number of customers for whom carbon tax is going to be a very real consideration. If we can just move to the next slide. Right, so just very briefly on carbon tax, just starting with, who is liable. So in other words, which of our customers is this going to be relevant to? What the Act says is that any person who conducts a listed activity and who emits greenhouse gases above a certain threshold is liable to the tax. So that's quite a broad sort of definition. The list of listed activities and the relevant thresholds are set out in detail in Section 2 to the Carbon Tax Act. I won't go through those in any sort of detail, but for example, if you're in brick manufacturing and you manufacture more than 4 million bricks, then that's the threshold for brick manufacturing. If you're in another business and you burn fuel as part of your business, generally the threshold is if you're using more than 10 megawatts thermal per year, then you're also above the threshold to register and pay for carbon tax. The specific greenhouse gas emissions, there's no limit on the greenhouse gases involved, so all greenhouse gases emissions attract the tax, and the Act contains quite detailed provisions in terms of how one then converts the emissions of other gases into a CO2 equivalent, so that ultimately the tax is imposed on a per kilogram of CO2 equivalent basis. If you can move to the next slide. So this is just a graph to sort of unpack what is the rate at which tax is payable. So the tax was introduced on 1 June 2019, and what has been communicated is that there are sort of 2 phases to the implementation of the tax. Phase 1 lasts until the end of 2022, after which we are told that the carbon tax will be reevaluated, the rate at which it is imposed will be reevaluated for the years following thereafter. What we expect that re-evaluation to mean is not that the rate will be reduced, but rather that some of the allowances and concessions which are available in phase one may well be phased out. In phase one, the tax started at 120 Rand per ton of CO2. And during phase one, that tax rate increases at CPI +2, but there are fairly significant allowances available against that. Between 60 and 95% of your CO2 emissions can be offset. And the 60% is a sort of a base tax-free allowance, and that's really where we expect to see a re-evaluation taking place from 2023 onwards. If you move to the next slide. So the question is, how does this carbon tax feed into the economic case for renewable energy, in particular for solar PV? And the answer is that one of the allowances that you can claim against your carbon tax liability is what they call a carbon offset allowance. So there are certain approved projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and you can a client can purchase effectively the credits from those, or if it's the client is if you're implementing that project yourself, you can obviously offset some of your emissions from that project. And the good news is that those approved projects include renewable energy generation. There is a limit on the percentage of your emissions that you can offset. So up to 10% of your emissions from fuel burning and 5% from industrial processes. But up to those limits, you can, for every ton of carbon saved, you can obviously save what the current rate of carbon tax, which is 134 Rand per ton. You can just move to the next slide. Very quickly, the question is, how does the renewable energy project qualify as an approved project? And really what you have to do is register under one of the recognized standards for carbon credit trading. So that's the CDM, the gold standard, or verified carbon standard, VCS standards. Once your project is registered, there's also a limitation or an exclusion that you can't claim carbon offset allowances for a project that is greater than 15 megawatts if you sell electricity at less than 1.09 Rand. I'm not entirely sure how they came up with those thresholds, but that's the provision in the Carbon Tax Act. But provided you meet both of those requirements, you should qualify for carbon offset allowances. And if you can move to the next slide. So in a couple of slides back, we saw that in South Africa, Eskom emits roughly a ton of CO2 per megawatt hour, or a kilogram of CO2 per kilowatt hour of electricity generated. And you can use that sort of intensity factor to calculate back that if from a renewable energy project, which qualifies as an approved project, can add about 12.6 cents per kilowatt hour delivered to a client in terms of carbon tax savings. So that can be quite a significant benefit and improve the case for renewable energy. You can move to the next slide. I think I'm sort of running over a little bit over time. I wanted to mention two other tax incentives that are available. I'm literally just going to mention them. There's a separate tax incentive which is available for energy efficiency projects as opposed to generation. And there's also a specific tax allowance for research and development of new technologies, which would apply to new technologies in the renewable energy industry. Just mentioning those for awareness. But yeah, those are the topics I wanted to cover today. So yeah, thank you very much.
Sorry, I was closing the blind, those lights. Thank you very much, Adam. I think there's also lots of questions for you. So if everybody, all the speakers could just put their cameras back on again, and then we'll go through some questions. We've got about 35 minutes left. I don't know if we'll get all the way to the end, but let's see how we go. Let's start I'll start with you, Adam, and then we'll work backwards. There is a question from De Villiers just saying, can the PPA provider use 12B, even though it might be their trade, as opposed to a once-off in the case of a retailer, for example? Does the first-time prohibition force a PPA provider to apply depreciation over the usual longer period?
No, so a PPA provider can claim the 12B deduction. This, the difference there is that your trade is the selling of electricity from a plant, but clearly, if you're using that plant in your trade, because that is the nature of your trade, then you can claim that deduction. There's no limitation for a PPA provider in terms of having to spread the deduction on a different basis.
Okay. De Villiers, hopefully that answers your question. You'll ping something up if it doesn't. I'll go, there's one for you, Hugh. What approach are you taking, or areas to focus on to persuade your credit committees to change their tune? And how far do wheeling regulations have to go before that can be achieved?
I think we're already quite well advanced in persuading them to change their tune. I think the wheeling discussion it's an unstoppable force, really. Unless we have wheeling, we're never going to solve the energy crisis in this country. So there's no point making legislation that 100 megawatts is the private sector can get on with doing anything up to 100 megawatts and then not have wheeling. There really isn't. So I think that that we're operating under that premise. And then, as I said, if you've got a product that is well priced for that's in demand, which electricity is, you'll always be able to sell it. I think where there might be some complexities, and this is where I think energy trading might come into it, is that your price for your electricity now might not be so attractive in 10 years' time. That's actually more for me a concern rather than the wheeling regulations. Is that the FD of a large corporate, say, might not want to lock himself into a tariff now for 15 years. I think FDs don't take that long-term view with their suppliers of anything, really. So you might only get a 5-year PPA. That's when it's going to get a little bit more tricky. Is to look into the future when you don't have a long-term PPA, and that's when maybe energy traders can become more relevant, and we'll find a market for power that's even a little bit more expensive if it's in demand.
Do you think that electricity prices are going to come down anytime soon, though? I guess it's a chicken and egg situation,
Well, yes, I think that's quite a long-term. The long-term view is that the Eskom prices aren't going to come down. There's still going to need to be. It will be many years until South Africa operates on baseload renewables, if ever. So I think you can always take that view that your price will be comparable. Will be attractive, rather. Might not be the cheapest in the market, but when it's available, it might be cheaper than anything else that say a corporate can get at that point in time.
Yeah, unavailable. Okay, thank you. So Josh and Bruno are those kids that do all their homework in time and so have answered all of the questions on here. I think I've managed to stop Josh from one, so I'll ask you one, and then Bruno, I'll re-ask the ones that you've answered. Josh said, thanks for an insightful overview. As for wheeling charges, City Power mentioned a blended tariff of 38 cents, but their margin on Megaflex is 33 cents. Should their wheeling charge not perhaps reflect the same margin they would have made on Eskom? Reason being that the same amount of kilowatt hours would still flow, and their benefit would be the transmission losses you mentioned.
Yeah, thanks.
Oh, we can't really hear you, Josh.
How's that? Is that better? All right. Thanks to Villiers. I think the wheeling sort of tariff sort of determination or tariff design is not quite yet defined. I think different municipalities and stakeholders and private sector and ESCOM have various opinions on how a wheeling tariff should be constructed and what it should reflect. So I think it's still up in the air, and different municipalities are doing different things. I think there's 7 or 8 wheeling tariffs now approved in municipalities. So, I mean, some private sectors say that the wheeling tariffs are too high and not yet financially viable to compete. But I think ESCOM tariffs just keep going up. So, I mean, it should at some point become viable. In De Villiers, I did look at your question and about the values. I would say it makes sense to me that a municipality should continue recovering their same surplus. So I think in this case, you said it was 33 cents difference between what they pay ESCOM and what they then sell it to the customers for. So it makes sense that the municipality just continues to recover that. So ideally that's cost reflective and recovers or reflects the costs of running the network and maintenance, etc., which the wheelers need to then pay for. So yeah, I agree with you that it should only reflect the 33 cents surplus as before. But on the other hand, I know some municipalities are adding an additional sort of billing admin fee on top of the previous surplus, because the argument is that wheeling is an additional administrative billing sort of service that the municipality provides to reconcile those accounts. I don't think it should be quite 6 cents per kilowatt hour. I mean, that's huge. But I think something in the range of sort of 200 to 300 Rand per month is what some municipalities are saying. That's just a small admin fee that they need to charge for the additional billing admin. But I think I completely agree with you, De Villiers. I also think the surplus should be the sort of wheeling fee at worst, at the highest possible wheeling fee. And then some private sector wheeling people argue that the wheeling tariff should be even lower than that the municipality can't continue to recover that high surplus. They only need to recover the cost of the grid. So I think that's sort of up in the air, and I think a lot of work will go into that wheeling tariff determination in the coming years as it becomes more and more viable.
Thanks, Josh. Bruno, one that was, I think, directed at you, but you missed, is have you taken O&M into consideration on the home loan calculations? It seems that you only look at the capital outlay. What about the O&M costs over the lifespan of the asset?
No, so that wasn't included in the calculation, but it shouldn't make a material difference. But we can, I think we can run that and send you a new slide with it.
I think it would be useful and interesting. We tend to see that, especially with the rooftop systems, people say solar PV is really easy, so we don't have to look after it, it's fine. And then you find that your plant hasn't been generating for a year, and so you've outlaid all of this capital. So I think it's a big risk that as an industry, we don't necessarily take into account. And maybe as lenders, you're so risk averse and everything else. Maybe be a little bit harder on the making sure that the plants are maintained and cleaned and operated properly. Right, that's my rant over. There is another question for, I think this one was for you, Josh. Have you done a study regarding realistic municipal wheeling charges? I mean, it's a little bit covering what you discussed in the last question, but if you have any studies carried out.
We've done some, not sort of detailed studies, but more sort of engagements with municipalities.
Speak up, please. Yeah.
All right. We've done not studies, but sort of engagements with municipalities and ESCOMs and AMU and SALGA, and sort of wheeling discussions on what approach should municipalities favor in absence of guiding national regulation, try and get sort of a aligned approach to wheeling. And I think municipalities tend to say, as I said, the first thing that municipalities want, the sort of non-negotiable, is that municipalities want to continue recovering that surplus that they recover from selling Eskom power. And so I think in the simplest form, the municipality can sort of credit Eskom Megaflex, because if there's a wheeling transaction, then the municipality doesn't have to buy Eskom power, so they're willing to credit that. And so that's the sort of baseline revenue neutral approach for the municipality. But sort of going into more detailed use of system charge calculations and which the fair components of a wheeling tariff are, I don't think there's been bits of work done there. We haven't gone into the details of it, but it builds on the sort of building blocks of a municipal cost of supply study on what it costs the municipality to maintain the grid. And then I think ideally what we want to move towards is municipalities sort of unbundling those tariffs so that there's a fixed use of system charge that a customer pays, and then an energy charge which can vary depending on where you get your energy from. So sort of separating the network business, wires business, and the energy business would be, I think, what people are saying. I mean, and what happens internationally too. But I don't have a detailed study on values. But yeah, I mean, probably something in the range of the municipal tariff less what their Megaflex tariff is. That's probably a starting point for a wheeling tariff.
Thanks, Josh. Hugh, maybe just following from that, you mentioned, and didn't go into too much detail, but on the energy trading side, has RMB looked into what that might look like in the future? Is that something you can talk to us about?
Yes, I don't think, we've looked into it from a banking perspective. I'll give you, as I did with the PPA length or the debt length, the Hugh view and the RMB view. I mean, obviously from an RMB view, do you have a bankable off-taker if you are selling to an IPP that's selling to an energy trader? There's always going to be that problem of having a termination payment that we've all known to grow and love from government in the REIT program. And can you give long-term debt to a short-term offtake? That's the other question that a bank will look at. So I think there are energy traders out there that I think we all know that there's Powerex, there's Energy Exchange looking to do this, and the biggest challenge is to find a balance sheet to back the short-term nature of the offtakes effectively. I do think that that problem is solvable. Again, it would need regulation though to unlock it so that we had more of a merchant market. And I know that might seem a long way off, but I think it might come quicker than we think. Well, I hope it does. At the moment, the energy traders it's almost a bilateral agreement. They're not trading freely, as they do in Europe, where you can buy power by the hour. So yes, I do think I think we will get there eventually. But at the moment, the problem is that they're still largely bilateral wheeling arrangements with a broker in the middle more than a trader. And I think that model needs to evolve. And the way it will evolve is to have larger pools of customers on either side.
That makes sense.
It is a bit of a chicken and egg situation, but ultimately, I think a few IPPs will be equity funded. There won't be banks involved. They won't have a long-term view, and they'll want to sell power to the highest bidder, and that's might unlock it.
Yeah. See, I think Namibia have the ability and the regulation for that to happen, and then there's a couple of companies looking at it there. So hopefully we follow on our neighbors. Thank you. Adam, I wanted to ask you one question just on the transferring of the self-build works, and if that is something that's being utilized in the models at the minute for the IPPs, or if it's new regulation that's come in for them to be able to, or because they can't claim for assets that they don't own.
So that's I mean, so currently you can claim for it for REIPP projects, and it's specifically an issue, as I pointed out, that arises in respect of transmission lines with your self-build agreements with Eskom and having to hand those over. My personal view is that if you had to build those lines and hand them over for a non-REIPP project, I think you should be able to claim that deduction in any event, just not under section, what's it, 12U, I think, 12D, sorry, is for power lines. But it's just interesting that they've made specific provision for this, this issue of having to hand things over under part of the self-build for the REIPP. One would hope they would then expand that and say, the same principle should apply in fairness to wheeling arrangements from other utility scale plants where you have the same issue.
Yeah, it sometimes seems like the right hand and the left hand don't always know what's happening.
You'd hope that with the raising of the generation license threshold to 100 megawatts and as wheeling, we hope and seems to be becoming more and more topical, and the regulatory movement seems to be in the right direction to allow that to happen. It's hopefully something that the revenue authorities would also pick up on and address. I seem to recall something that they are aware of the issue and that there might be a tax amendment that's going to deal with that, but it's just one to watch in the interim.
The wheels of progress turn slowly. So I think that all of there's a couple of other questions, but I think they've been covered in the Q&A and answered by basically typed into the Q&A, so I won't cover those. I want to thank our speakers. It's been a really interesting session. Thank you for taking us along the pathway of distributed generation business models, right from Hugh and the, I guess, utility scale bankers' view of the world, right through municipalities, how we claim back on our taxes and how we get systems onto our roofs. If any of you have questions as the audience that you want to ask, the Sapia team will share both the slides and the recording. It'll be on the website as well. And I think you can reach out to Kim on marketing@sapia.co.za if you have any questions or you want people's contact details. I want to thank our sponsors again, RMB and Genesis Eco Energy, and the speakers. And please do sign up for the next webinar, which will be towards the end of next month. Thank you very much for your time. I think we've hopefully it was useful and interesting for all of you.
Thanks all. Thanks, Chanda.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks, Chanda.
Thank you.
Thanks.